Hello, my name's Tim Seburn, and this is a presentation on the human history at Point Abno, including our ecological footprint there, our attempts at conservation over the years, and the history of the Marcy family. I want to thank those who provided information and photos for me, whose names will appear on the screen. Where's Marcy's Woods? Well, it's on Point Abno. And where is Point Abno? It is the fourth most prominent point on Lake Erie. In this satellite view, the furthest east and not as noticeable as the first 3 points. Today, these points all still have French names. From west east, we have Point Peely or Bald, Rondeau or Round, Long Point or Long, and Point Abno, named after Father Claude Avenot, an early Jesuit missionary. In 1679, the French launched the first fur trading ship on Lake Erie, the Griffin, and by 1684 their maps of Lake Erie showed the first 3 points, but not Point Abno. 4 years later, the 1688 French map showed fur traders transiting the upper lakes all the way from Fort Erie here, all the way through Lake Erie, Lake Huron, Lake Illinois, now Lake Michigan, all the way to Chicago. And if we zoom in on Lake Erie, the French were safer on the north side of the lake, where there were points for safe harbor and where they were much less likely to encounter the Iroquois, against whom they had declared war in 1686. Point Abno is shown on the map, but the only point named is Long Point. John Riley, author of the Once and Future Great Lakes Country, the best historical book for our region in my judgment, thought it was possible that Cadillac, the French commandant, may have prevented Avonneau's name from being put on maps of the day due to a serious disagreement he had with him over the treatment of the Miami Nation at St. Joseph's Mission near Fort Detroit. A 1749 French map has it marked as Dabino, and this 1755 map has Point Abno marked as Abino. This confusion over the name was entered by historians, including Peter Andrews, editor of the Buffalo Courier Express, who determined the point was the location of Avonneau's summer mission during his assignment to the Ottawa between the years 1686 through 1689, after which he was assigned to the mission at St. Joseph's. So Avonneau was certainly the first prominent Frenchman to reside on the point. And the use of Avonneau as the name for the point could not be snuffed out among the illiterate voyageurs who, each April, once the ice had melted, would accompany the father on fur trade route from the St. Lawrence to his seasonal cabin on the point, our first summer resident. When the French period ended in 1759, trade and settlement continued to expand westward. Traffic past Point Abno increased and then multiplied after the Erie Barge Canal opened in 1821. Shipwrecks at Point Abno became common. A lighthouse was not built here until 1917. In mid-September 1796, ill winds kept an Irishman named Isaac Weld at Point Abno for a couple days. Weld published an account of his travels, which included a 1780s French map with Abno spelt as shown here, with the letter B replacing the V in Avonneau. Weld was a keen observer and left us with a detailed description of Abonneau. He was struck by the series of almost parallel dunes. Most of these dunes still exist as seen on this recent hillshade map. The prevailing wind and surf pushed sand the entire length of Lake Erie up onto the rocks at the point. Some of these dunes are more than 60 feet high, like this particular dune right here. Depending on the lake level, Erie percolates through these dunes into Abonneau's backshore swamp, which is defined by this line here. In 1796, a petition to build a mill on a creek right here was opposed by residents, understanding a mill would flood their land. The mill was never built. Weld also described the active coastal sand dune, as did Zenkirk, who published this photo in 1934. These dunes are still active today along most of Point Abno. Here's the coastal dune at Marcy's, after the October 31st, 2019 storm. Weld did not mention seeing an Indian village here. However, based on pottery shards, the point was used beginning in the Middle Woodland period around 1000 BC. In 1855, local resident Cyrus Bert showed an archaeologist this fall hunting or fishing camp. There were two longhouses, one over 360 feet here and another 120 feet here. The neutrals, as they were called by the French, had good diplomatic relations with their neighbors and dominated Niagara until 1650, when they were exposed by changes brought on by the fur trade and scattered by the Iroquois. Niagara then became mostly uninhabited, unlike the south side of the lake, where the Six Nations continued to do fall burnings, maintaining long stretches of prairies, so buffalo could make their annual trek to the salt lick at Buffalo Creek. Point Abino was included in the 1792 Between the Lakes Treaty, shown in purple here. This was the third treaty for Niagara between the Mississauga and the British, and this is a good time to recall that Canada was created by a series of agreements between various First Nations and the French or the British, which eventually extended Canada from coast to coast to coast. These treaties should be honored in accordance with recent Supreme Court of Canada decisions, and we should all strive to do our land use planning 7 generations into the future, as is the native tradition. The year after the treaty, plans were made to survey the remainder of Bertie Township, but the survey lines were not continued out onto the point, possibly because Joseph Brant intended to establish a warrior camp there. During the War of 1812, the point was occupied by British militia, maybe as many as 500 native warriors. Later in the war, American troops captured and briefly occupied the point. In 1815, this map was created by British Lieutenant Neufeld, which is interesting as it shows the roads in the area at that time. And I want to particularly note one road here, which led from Miller's Creek on the Niagara River all the way down along what is now Ridge Road and Ridgeway today. And this would allow voyageurs to reach Point Abino while they waited out storms on the lake. Construction of the terminus of the Erie Canal was beginning in Buffalo around this time. According to an interview Eve Stoner Shirk gave to the Welland Tribune in 1899, Indians often visited her family's cabin when she was young. This steady stream of visitors began to include non-natives in 1818, when a Buffalo-based steamboat began ferrying visitors to Point Abino. A Seneca chief was asked to name the boat. He dubbed it Walks in the Water. In 1819, the Dennis family and Otway Page, who lived on the point, hired John Birch to survey the point for them. The survey Birch produced had serious errors, and later, when the survey lines were correctly extended, as seen in this 1828 map, it was found that most of the entire tip lies within Lot 32 and not in Lot 33, as had been determined by the faulty 1819 survey. Prior to 1800, development by settlers at Point Abino seems to have occurred only on Lot 32, the actual point itself. And if we zoom in on the tip of Lot 32, in 1796, Weld noted only 2 cabins on the point and no Indian village. Timothy Skinner, a loyalist who was likely the first settler to reside out on the point, built log cabins here in 1787 and 1789. Ezekiel Dennis, who arrived in 1786, was the first of many Quakers and later other plainclothes people who established themselves between the modern village of Ridgeway and the Sugarloaf at Port Colborne. The Dennis family lived in the cabins built by Skinner, and by the time of Weld's visit, they had cleared 30 acres, as you can see here, between these 2 cabins. Weld also noted a portage across the point. This Indian village that I have marked here was not seen by Weld, but this is the location of that Indian village from the earlier slide. When Harvey Holdsworth, a recent resident of Point Abino, was interviewed by the Fort Erie Library in 1985, he said he knew where an Indian garden was located. In the 1930s, Zenkirk published a photo of this area and concluded his botanical book of our region with a heady description of the site. He wrote, In seas and calms, St. John's wort and the hairy puccoon heighten the exotic effect of the scene with their showy yellow and orange-yellow flowers. Inducive as the sequestered spot is to serene contemplation, it has become known as the Garden of the Gods. Believe it or not, in the 1850s, Abeno was world famous as a location for prize fights. Over 200 one-minute rounds in one bout left one fighter dead, the winner in jail, and the promoter fined in Buffalo, even though the fight happened in Canada. These fights were held on Marcy's Beach, where they would be hidden from prying eyes. An early evangelist took the opportunity to preach to the fight fans who sat on driftwood along the coastal dune. But there was little change, and any development was still confined to the east side of Lot 32. According to 1870 surveyor's notes, the only structures on the point included this small lime kiln and 2 or 3 small houses and a barn. Buffalonians continued to come to enjoy the beach and to get out of the city. Others came for open-air church services on the beach. Interestingly, both Erie Beach and Crystal Beach amusement parks started out as religious gatherings. In 1887, there were 103 baptisms here. However, at the same time, a serious assault on Point Abeno had begun. In the 1870s and 1880s, vast amounts of sand were mined by a guy named Holloway. Initially, horses hauled boxcars of sand up these rails, where the sand was dumped into barges below. Later, a small engine hauled the boxcars along the rail. This led to the first conservation attempt in the form of an 1884 letter to Prime Minister Sir John A. Macdonald from Otway Page, who decried the destruction of beautiful Point Abeno. Page and Holloway had a famous Point Abeno property dispute that went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. In an earlier letter, Page worried Holloway's barges could be used to bring Fenians to Point Abeno. However, wealth came when electricity and industrialization arrived in Buffalo around 1891, then called the City of Lights. Lights in bottles you couldn't blow out. The dunes at Abeno were now worth more as a forced retreat for the wealthy than as sand for construction. In 1894, the Pere Abeno subdivision is proposed by Holloway, the first of 4 plans to be eventually approved for the point. Holloway's property was quickly bought by a number of prominent Buffalo businessmen who marketed it as a nature retreat from the bad air in Buffalo. References to promote the point were obtained from David Day and George B. Hayes, men we will learn more about in a minute. The second, the Page subdivision, is approved in 1899. Since Americans now view their properties as nature retreats within the wilds of Canada, this point put Point Abeno on a path towards greater conservation. Does anyone remember this old water tower at Point Abeno? In 1926, Holloway also created the Abeno Hills subdivision, and on this 1934 air photo, the road still appears new. In this view, you can also see where sand has been mined at the end of Holloway Bay Road, and here at what was the Baird subdivision, now Abeno Dunes subdivision, the 4th and final subdivision plan approved for the point. I've recently become more aware of the impact of Prohibition on Fort Erie. Buffalo was dry from 1920 to 1933, and Rick Stockton tells me this house on Holloway Bay Road was owned by a bootlegger. I'm still trying to determine if this house had any connection to a famous 1926 incident dubbed the Battle of Point Abeno. So what has been the impact on the natural environment of over 2 centuries of various saints and sinners at Abeno? Let's start with mammals. The fur trade was devastating on beaver, but in the 1980s, they snuck back out onto Point Abeno. And fishers recently returned based on this Marcy Woods game cam photo. All the points along the north shore of Lake Erie were once famous for large numbers of black bear that migrated south every fall. In the fall of 1721, over 400 were taken at Point Pelee alone. At Point Abeno, the bears funneled to the lake between the dunes, which made for easy hunting. Black bears haven't yet made their way back to Point Abeno, and it would take a long-term commitment from humans to help make that happen. Look familiar? Check your change. An old elk bone eroded out of a dune at Marcy's around 2002. Early visitors to the north shore of Lake Erie saw large herds of elk, almost as many as deer. Elk were extirpated from Ontario in 1893, but have now been successfully reintroduced. Maybe one day they will make their return to Point Avenue. The eastern cougar, or longtail, for whom our lake is named, is likely extinct. But western cougars are expanding their range and again breed in the upper peninsula of Michigan, Quebec, and possibly New Brunswick, which is where this animal was road-killed. From occasional sightings, radio tags, and even a DNA sample from Wainfleet Bog, we know western cougars occasionally pass through Niagara. They certainly have large paws. Rick Doan recently posted on Facebook a 1901 Buffalo article describing a cougar family living near Crystal Beach. One was shot and killed. So 1901 is the latest sighting of an eastern cougar that I'm aware of for Niagara. From tracks at Marcy's that Ernie Giles once showed me, recent sightings in Fort Erie, and this one in Port Colborne, we know a few bobcat are still around. According to the caption, these were wolves taken from Point Avenue in the 1940s. But look at the pointed ears. Holding a wolf up with one hand? Actually, we now know coyotes made their way into Niagara by 1918. But in this 2020 Niagara photo by Laurie Allen, notice the more rounded ears, and I'm sure I couldn't hold up one of these guys by one arm. Recent DNA tests showed a Niagara coyote to be more than 30% wolf. Did red wolves hold on in Wainfleet Bog, and did they interbreed with coyotes when they arrived? What about birds? Well, the most common bird by far was the passenger pigeon. A single flock contained billions of birds. They were a Maine survival staple until 1890, and reportedly delicious. The Senecas prepared squabs and servings of a half dozen with strings tied around their necks so guests could avoid getting their fingers greasy. The last confirmed sighting of a passenger pigeon in Ontario was mid-September 1891 at Shirkston by this guy, Ottomar Renecke. By 1917, the bird that had been by far the most numerous bird in the world was extinct. Isaac Weld surprisingly reported lots of spruce grouse in 1796. Still lots of these guys further north, but not at Point Avenue. Presumably, there was once more black spruce growing here. We haven't heard the rough grouse at Marcy's Woods for a few years, but it might still be there. Not sure if the prothonotary warbler is still at Avenue. Folks seldom go into the huge swamp where this bird lives, so they could still be hiding there. Since DDT was banned, bald eagles have made a big comeback. There are several nests now in Niagara, and I'm sure there's one in Point Avenue that I've yet to find. We would like to find it soon as the Breeding Bird Atlas Survey, which happens every 20 years, started this year. Dr. Marcy tried releasing wild turkeys he bought from Howard Fretz, but they didn't know to fly up into trees to roost at night, so foxes ate them. Years later, wild birds from Pennsylvania were successfully reintroduced to Ontario, and they have now made their way back to Point Avenue. Impileated woodpecker reappeared around 2001 at Marcy's Woods, where Rob Eberly showed me Niagara's first fledglings. And there's still a few of these guys for which Fort Erie is famous. Red-headed woodpecker. In fact, based on a radar study conducted by John Black from Brock University, the Point Avenue Peninsula has been designated as an important bird area due to its importance for spring migration. How are herps doing? Well, our famous Fowler's toad is still there, and frogs, salamanders, and turtles are doing okay. And even this guy might still be there. When Isaac Weld visited, he was told about the hognose snake, but doubted its existence as too far-fetched. A snake that spread its hood like a cobra and hissed loudly and then would play dead? This was apparently too awesome to be believed, but it is indeed true. How about botanical species? Well, the David Day I referred to earlier was a lawyer who had a summer home at Point Avenue and served as the president of the Buffalo Society of Natural Sciences. He was the first to publish a systematic botanical inventory of our region, including a thorough inventory of Point Avenue in 1883, many years before the Holloway Bay subdivision was proposed. The wild rice he noted at Point Avenue now seems to be gone, even though Zenkert's 1934 book included this photo of some. Wild rice was an important resource for natives and pioneers. Another species possibly missing is the native cranberry, which has not been recently recorded. Residents, including the Schoolies, who lived near where Cherry Hill Golf Club is now, were collecting cranberries into the 1890s here. And here's another missing plant, pitcher plant, one of our insect-eating plants. It has also not been recorded for years. But other than that, I believe all other of Abeno's botanical species recorded by David Day are still present, which is remarkable in view of how sensitive sandhill forests are to disturbance. You may have seen this recent post on the Bert Miller Nature Club Facebook page notifying members that scientists needed help finding this globally rare and disappearing species of fungus. According to a 2001 article by Earl Plato, this species occurred in Marcy's Woods, and I see no reason why it shouldn't still be there. Our spring hike was postponed due to pandemic restrictions, and we now hope to hike Marcy Woods in September. Please join us and help us confirm this rare species is still there. How did the Marcy family come to be at the point? Dr. Marcy's maternal grandfather was a man named George B. Hayes, the same man who gave a reference for the subdivision. George left his fur-trading family in Ohio to become a telegrapher in Buffalo. He married well and went into pipe making with his father-in-law, a French-Canadian, originally from London, Ontario, who had become director of the New York Central Railway. After falling from a carriage, George's father-in-law died in 1883, and George became the sole owner of the cast iron pipe company in Buffalo. In 1895, he acquired land at 683 Point Abeno Road on the bay, just north of the Page subdivision, and built this house, which still stands. By all accounts, he was an affable man and a huge supporter of the science and the arts in Buffalo. George on the far left here enjoyed the outdoors. In fact, you may have seen this 1897 photo of him in the Algonquin Park Museum. When Dr. Marcy showed me this photo, he told me Lake Louisa was named for George's wife, Louisa Drolyard. However, I checked this out with the Algonquin Park historian. George is not known to have visited the Lake Louisa area, which is named on an 1854 survey map, only 3 years after Louisa was born and well before George Hayes was in the area. Although the surveyor of the Lake, John Snow, went to school in Potsdam, New York, he had no known connection to the Drolyard family. Dr. Marcy also told me the Drolyards helped burn down Buffalo during the War of 1812, and as it turns out, this tale might be true. And here's the Hayes family at Point Abeno around 1904. From left to right, we have Alice Marcy Hayes, who shortly after this photo was taken became the mother of Dr. George Marcy, many of you knew, so he's in her belly here. Then we have George Hayes, the man I was just speaking of, Dr. Marcy's maternal grandfather. Next is Hilda Hayes, the teenager. Then we have Dr. Marcy's grandmother. By all accounts, she was a brilliant woman. Then we have William Marcy, Dr. Marcy's father, who was also a doctor. And then we have the coachman, whose name I don't know. And note the bicycle in the carriage. This again is Dr. Marcy's mom, Alice, when she was older. She was a great naturalist and birder. She knew her bird calls and could even imitate them, a more common skill before the advent of portable tape players. Rather than wanting a home overlooking the lake with everyone else on the coastal dune, she learned where migrating birds were being funneled between the merging dunes and wanted a cabin built there. So in 1927, she and her husband William acquired land on Lot 34, and work on the cabin began. Here are the windows being put in. Done, just in time for the first snowfall. You needed to ski into the cabin in the winter, and it was a cold and snowy drive without a roof on your car, eh? In 1930, they also acquired property including the beach on Lot 35, where a number of vacation cottages known as the Kennels were built. This is Dr. Marcy's mom and dad at the Kennels Beach in 1932, the same beach where the Battle of Point Abeno occurred a couple years earlier. Later, a big closed-in deck was added to the cabin to accommodate the growing family. Here's the final form of the cabin. This is Dr. George Marcy. He was an orthopedic surgeon in Buffalo who pioneered the use of penicillin on the battlefield during World War II. Although he was a medical doctor, he loved farming. When his parents, Alice and William, passed away, they left the Kennels property to his sister Hilda and the woods with the cabin to him. These are Dr. Marcy's 4 children enjoying the fire at the cabin. From the left, Bart, then Polly, Patty, and on the right is Peggy. The bomb shelter built in the coastal dune for the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis became a favored spot for hognose snake to hang out. The same year, 1962, Dr. Marcy heard the old Near family farmhouse on Mitchener Road was up for sale and immediately sent his teenage daughter Peggy to the farmhouse with $50 in her pocket to secure his offer. Later, other adjoining parcels were acquired as well. In 1971, there was a movement to make beaches accessible to the public, and Dr. Marcy and other property owners on Point Avenue were advised their properties were to be expropriated. Naturalists and scientists on both sides of the border came to their aid, though, pointing out the special and vulnerable nature of Point Avenue, which needed to be protected. It was also noted there were many beaches like Sherkston and Bay Beach more suitable for public swimming. This letter from Gus Yaki, the founder of the Niagara Falls Nature Club, who recently passed away, was one of many that helped put an end to the expropriation effort. I personally first met Dr. Marcy around 1982. I remember going to the rear closed-in porch of the farmhouse you see here and asking for permission to go for a hike. I was given tea and cookies and interviewed for what seemed like an eternity. Finally, I was asked to sign a guest book. The guest book showed a steady stream of visitors from the Niagara frontier and several other countries. I was finally allowed to make my way to the woods, and I walked past the cabin. And when I entered what you might call the cathedral area, I'm sure you know where I mean, I got goosebumps. On my way out, I stopped again at the farmhouse to ask Dr. Marcy what he intended to do with the woods. He told me he was leaving it to his kids, and that he had drawn lots out for each of them on the coastal dune. I told him I disagreed with this, but he didn't seem to be offended by my directness. In 1988, Dr. Marcy gave my phone number to a friend of his concerned about the removal of a dune at the point. I called the only ecological superhero I knew this guy. As it turned out, although I didn't know it at the time, the Garden of the Gods had just been destroyed. 81 condominiums had been approved and construction was starting. I worried about the environmental impact this vast number of new residents would have on the point. On my right, now in his street clothes, is again Dr. Axtell, a retired curator from the Buffalo Museum of Science. We connected with my high school coach, Mike Clarkson, who happened to be doing a Species at Risk in Niagara series with the St. Catherine Standard, who did this article. It worked. The developer, whose wife was a member of the Buffalo Audubon Society, asked to meet and voluntarily agreed to scale the development down to 26 homes. 15 site plan restrictions were also put in place to require native species only be planted, which would help to keep out invasives. This is Dear Harold as I remember him. A link to a short biodoc on his life is in the description of this video. In March 1960, the Marcys were on vacation in Mexico, and Mrs. Marcy had her purse stolen by a boy on a motorcycle. They were surprised when the first person on the scene was Harold, who happened to be in Mexico doing a field trip from the Museum of Science, so maybe he really was a superhero. Years later, when Dr. Marcy was late in life, he received a letter from a friend of his, Dave Marr, one of Fort Erie's finest photographers. Dave suggested Dr. Marcy arrange to permanently conserve the woods rather than leave them to his children. Dr. Marcy agreed and arranged a meeting with Nature Conservancy of Canada on May 13, 1994, with Dave, Earl Plato, Dr. Richard Stockton, and myself. However, sadly, Dr. Marcy passed away only 2 months later before conservation arrangements could be finalized. Earl Plato was a retired principal who became an author. He had a popular nature column, When Nature Calls. In January 1995, Earl ran an ad in the Fort Erie Times Review and raised enough interest to create a nature club, of which he was the first president. The club would make preserving Marcy Woods one of its founding objectives. While discussions continued between Nature Conservancy of Canada and the Marcy family, the Bert Miller Nature Club conducted extensive biological studies on the property to justify its conservation. On September 26, 1998, Rob Eberly, then the president of the Bert Miller Nature Club, arranged what would prove to be a key meeting at the cabin. Every level of government and all community stakeholders were present. Dave LeBay, on the left from the Native Friendship Center, was our spiritual facilitator for the evening. Those holding the eagle feather spoke only the truth, and all others remained silent until it was their turn to hold the feather. When Patricia and Zavino and other local teachers wanted to take their class through the woods, sometimes they would arrange for Dave LeBay to provide a sweetgrass ceremony. Earl, Rob, and I led many outings with classes over the years. A couple times I've run into students as adults and had them thank me for the hike at Marcy's that they experienced as a child. Then, in 1999, Mrs. Marcy also died. And the majority of the Marcy siblings felt the property would fare better under private ownership and opted to put the property on the open market rather than accept an offer from Nature Conservancy of Canada. Marcy's Property, Inc. included the property outlined in blue here. The Marcy siblings were also willed the property outlined in red and green by Dr. Marcy's late sister Hilda. Around October 1st, 2002, the property was sold to the DiCienzo's family. This resulted in litigation between the Marcy siblings. There had been a constant series of news articles on Marcy's Woods and Niagara newspapers. Now the story became national. A New York State court approved the sale of the property to the DiCienzo's family, and the following summer, heavy equipment showed up in the woods. In the event such an emergency ever arose, a rough plan had been outlined years before to launch war canoes and paddle them to Queen's Park. This plan was put into motion. The launch was covered by the national media. This article is from the Buffalo News. The first day's paddle was to Old Fort Erie. The second day was to be from Niagara-on-the-Lake to 50 Point, but it was too windy that day to safely launch. The third leg was from 50 Point to Burlington Bay, where a crowd came out to show their support. The final leg was to Toronto. We needed to reach Toronto by noon to be on CBC News Live. As we paddled, I worried about the permits which I had applied for but had not received due to a province-wide blackout that occurred between August 14th to the 28th. A permit was needed to enter the Toronto harbor. As we entered the harbor master's boat came by and thankfully tooted his horn in support. We barely made it to Toronto in time for the noon news. Melanie Mullen, whose family was the main organizers for us, did some of the media interviews. Melanie is now an actress in Los Angeles. A permit from the Toronto Police was needed to parade up University Avenue to Queen's Park, but when we arrived at University Avenue, a policeman on a bike greeted us and told us we were early. He asked us to hold up till he get his crew organized to escort us. It was over 90 degrees, and our seniors were exhausted. Rob had insisted the canoes remain strapped to the trailers, but once we paused for the police, some of the students grabbed a canoe and amazingly started running with it, even though it weighed over 600 pounds. Rob yelled at them, then asked the officer to stop them. The officer just laughed at Rob and said he'd better run to catch up with him. I couldn't believe it. They made it all the way to Queen's Park, where it turns out a permit had been issued to allow us to assemble. This action resulted in the government issuing a ministerial zoning order to prevent any development at Marcy's Woods. The heavy equipment was indeed only used to improve the road, as had been stated by the owner of the property, DiCienzo's. And today, the property and cabin are used only as a family retreat. The family has since acquired properties with homes that abut Marcy's Woods. After this article came out, Deanna Lindblad and I met with Dino DiCienzo Jr. and provided him copies of all the biological studies that had been undertaken. These were kindly accepted with appreciation, and since this time there has been excellent relations with the Bert Miller Nature Club. The Nature Club has coordinated several beach grass plantings for the DiCienzo's coastal dunes. Here, Albert Garofalo, our coordinator, has corms of beach grass neatly laid out. Probably more than 100 students from various high schools have eagerly volunteered to help at one of the planting events. And the DiCienzo family have proven to be extraordinary hosts, opening up their deck to provide lunch for students at spring events. This is Dr. Richard Stockton in the foreground. And the DiCienzo's have even opened up the cabin itself for events held in the fall and winter, so the students can stay warm and get some hot food in their bellies. Simply wonderful for the students to experience this. The Nature Conservancy of Canada has since acquired the land highlighted in green here to help prevent invasive species from getting a foothold on the Point Abino Peninsula. And Marcy's Woods has indeed continued to fare well under private stewardship. That such a fragile sandhill forest is still almost completely intact in the year 2021 is truly remarkable. Naturalists worldwide offer a truly heartfelt thank you to the DiCienzo's for the continued protection of Marcy's Woods. Now I want to go back to the time we started this adventure, to the French period. It was the evening of May 27th, 1721, when Charlevoix, a French explorer, stopped at Point Abino. Interestingly, the trees had not yet leafed out. Hard to imagine today when our leaves are almost out in April. To end, I'm going to quote from Charlevoix's journal as he describes camping at Point Abino and other locations along the north shore of Lake Erie. Each day a situation chosen with pleasure, a neat and commodious house built and furnished with everything in less than a quarter of an hour, and floored with a pavement of flowers, continually springing up on a carpet of the most beautiful green. On all sides, simple and natural beauty, unadulterated and unequaled by any art. We are no more than pilgrims on this earth. We have no right to use but as passengers the good things of this world.